Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring a mystery that shook an entire nation to its core, divided public opinion like no other case in modern Indian history, and ultimately left two families shattered, two lives ended, and an entire judicial system's credibility called into question. A 13-year-old girl was found dead in her own bedroom. A man who worked for her family was found dead on the rooftop of that same apartment the very next day. And the crime scene, the single most important piece of evidence in any murder investigation, was contaminated almost immediately. Here's what happened. Convictions are handed down, and then those convictions are overturned. And in the end, after more than 15 years, nobody has been held accountable for two deaths. Nobody stands convicted. The case is, legally and practically speaking, unsolved. This is the story of the Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade murder case. A case so riddled with investigative failures, so tangled in conflicting forensic evidence, and so deeply entrenched in public controversy that it produced a book, a film, a Netflix documentary, and a legal journey that wound through local police departments, India's Central Bureau of Investigation, a special criminal court, the Allahabad High Court, and ultimately to the steps of the Supreme Court of India. We are going to walk through every detail of this case today. The night in question, the initial discovery, the catastrophic failures of the first investigation, the transfer to the CBI and the fractured investigations that followed. The trial, the convictions, and the extraordinary acquittal that left the entire country asking the same question: if not them, then who? Let's start at the beginning. The Talwars lived in flat L32 of Jalvayu Vihar, a two-story apartment. They also employed a live-in domestic worker, a Nepali man named Hemraj Banjade, who handled household duties and had worked for the family for an extended period. On the night of May 15, 2008, everything appeared normal. The family had their evening routine. The apartment was locked and secured, as it was on any other night. What happened inside those walls between the night of May 15 and the early morning of May 16 has never been definitively established in a court of law. That is the central fact that drives everything else in this case. We do not know, with legal certainty, what happened that night. What we do know, based on court records and news archives, is what the morning of May 16, 2008 looked like. When the door was finally opened, Aarushi was found deceased in her bed. She had sustained injuries consistent with a sharp weapon. The details of those injuries are documented in court records, but in keeping with our commitment to victim dignity, we will not describe them beyond what is strictly necessary to understand the investigation. Rajesh Talwar called for help. The police were summoned. Hemraj Banjade was not present in the apartment, and at first, investigators and family members assumed that he had either fled or was somehow involved in what had happened to Aarushi. This assumption would drive the very early hours of the investigation in a particular direction, one that would prove deeply consequential. And this is where the first catastrophic mistake was made. When investigators from the Noida police arrived at the apartment, the crime scene was not secured the way it should have been. This is not speculation. This is documented in subsequent court proceedings and has been extensively reported across multiple news sources including BBC News, The Hindu, and the Indian Express. Media reporters, neighbors, and other individuals gained access to the flat. The scene was photographed by press cameras while it was still active. Potential physical evidence was moved, touched, or compromised. The chain of custody for critical forensic material was damaged before it was ever properly established. But that was only the beginning of the failures. Nobody searched the terrace. In that time, any evidence on or around that terrace had been exposed to the elements, to foot traffic, and to the general contamination of a scene that was not protected. This was not a minor procedural lapse. This was a failure of fundamental investigative practice. And it would haunt every subsequent attempt to understand what had happened in that apartment on the night of May 15. According to public court records and media accounts that have been extensively documented over the years, several critical pieces of potential evidence were either lost, compromised, or contested from the very beginning. The bottle of alcohol found at the scene, the forensic samples taken from the bodies, the condition of the crime scene itself. Each of these became a battleground not because the evidence was complicated to interpret, but because the basic work of preserving it had not been done properly. Now, I want to ask you something directly, because this question matters for everything that comes after. When a crime scene is contaminated this severely, right at the start, does it even become possible to build a case that meets the legal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt? Think about that as we go forward in this story, because that question is at the heart of every decision a court eventually made in this case. The names of some of these individuals were floated publicly in press reports, which itself became a significant controversy. People were being named, publicly identified as suspects or persons of interest, without formal charges being filed. The Indian media, which was covering this case with enormous intensity from the very first days, became part of the story in a way that complicated the investigation significantly. The pressure on law enforcement was immense. Noida is not a remote backwater. It sits adjacent to the capital of the world's largest democracy. Aarushi Talwar's parents were educated professionals. The case had socio-economic and cultural dimensions that made it a flashpoint for broader national conversations. And the police were not performing well under that pressure. By late May 2008, the Central Bureau of Investigation was called in. The CBI is India's premier investigative agency, roughly analogous in function and scope to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States. It is the agency brought in when local investigators are overwhelmed, when a case has national significance, or when there are serious concerns about the quality of the local investigation. On May 31, 2008, the case was officially transferred to the CBI. And here is where the story gets even more complicated. But this first CBI team was eventually replaced. A second CBI team took over the investigation, and the second team reached very different conclusions. Rather than developing a case against any of the alternative suspects, the second CBI team found that the evidence against those individuals was insufficient to support charges. In December 2010, this second team filed what is known in the Indian legal system as a closure report. A closure report effectively tells the court that the investigating agency has concluded that it cannot make a prosecutable case. It is not an acquittal. It is not a declaration of innocence. It is an acknowledgement that the evidence does not support taking the matter to trial. However, the closure report filed by the second CBI team in December 2010 did something unusual. It named Rajesh Talwar and Nupur Talwar as suspects. The report stated that the investigators believed the parents were responsible for the deaths of both Aarushi and Hemraj, but that the evidence available was not sufficient to prove this in court. They were, in effect, declaring their belief in who the perpetrators were while simultaneously acknowledging they did not have the evidence to prove it. This is an extraordinary position for an investigating agency to take. And it set the stage for what came next. And for the next several years, Rajesh and Nupur Talwar went through the Indian criminal justice system while the entire country watched. The prosecution's case, as documented in the trial court's judgment of November 2013, was built on circumstantial evidence. There was no direct eyewitness to either murder. There was no murder weapon conclusively identified and tied to any specific person. There was no confession. The case rested on inferences drawn from the physical evidence, from the condition of the crime scene, from what the prosecution argued was a pattern of behavior that implicated the parents. Among the key elements of the prosecution's circumstantial case were arguments about the layout of the apartment and who could have had access to it. The apartment was described as locked in a specific way on the night of the murders. The prosecution argued that given the manner in which the apartment was secured and the nature of the injuries sustained by the victims, the evidence pointed toward someone who was already inside the apartment. They argued that Hemraj's body being found on the terrace, rather than inside the apartment, was significant. They argued about the condition in which Aarushi's body was found and what that suggested about events that night. The defense disputed every one of these inferences. The defense argued that the contaminated crime scene made it impossible to draw reliable conclusions from physical evidence. They argued that the investigation had been botched from the very first hours. They argued that alternative suspects had not been adequately investigated. They argued that the prosecution's case was built on speculation dressed up as inference. In November 2013, the CBI Special Court in Ghaziabad found Rajesh Talwar and Nupur Talwar guilty of the murders of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade, and also guilty of the destruction of evidence. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. Sen's reporting documented inconsistencies in the prosecution's case and what he characterized as a deeply troubled investigative and judicial process. The book became an important contribution to the public conversation about the case. Rajesh and Nupur Talwar appealed their conviction to the Allahabad High Court. And on October 12, 2017, the Allahabad High Court overturned both convictions. The court observed that the chain of circumstantial evidence had significant gaps. It noted that for a conviction based entirely on circumstantial evidence to stand, the circumstances must be fully established, must be consistent only with the guilt of the accused, and must be such that they exclude every hypothesis except the guilt of the accused. The court found that the prosecution's case did not meet this standard. The acquittal was also sharply divided in public reception, mirroring the verdict that preceded it. Those who had believed the parents were innocent saw the High Court judgment as vindication. Those who had believed in the trial court's findings saw it as a failure of justice. And everyone, on every side of the debate, was left with the same uncomfortable truth. 2 people were dead, and nobody had been held accountable. After nearly a decade, after 2 investigations, after a closure report, after a trial, after a conviction, after an appeal, the case was back where it had started. Unsolved. The CBI filed an appeal against the High Court's acquittal in the Supreme Court of India. As of public records available at the time of this script's preparation, that appeal process has not concluded with a final judgment reinstating any conviction. The current legal status of the case is that no perpetrator stands convicted for the deaths of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade. The Noida police failed to secure the crime scene. They failed to search the terrace. They lost time and evidence in those critical first hours that can never be recovered. The first CBI team pursued one set of suspects. The second CBI team pivoted to a completely different theory. The closure report was rejected by the court. The trial proceeded on evidence that the High Court ultimately found insufficient. And through all of it, the fundamental question, what happened in that apartment on that night, was never answered to any legal standard of proof. This is a story about institutional failure as much as it is about a crime. And it raises questions that go far beyond any individual case. The first major evidentiary issue was the state of the crime scene. As I mentioned earlier, the apartment was not properly secured in the immediate aftermath of the discovery of Aarushi's body. Media personnel entered the flat. Visitors were present. The crime scene, which should have been a carefully controlled environment from the first moments of discovery, was compromised before forensic specialists had a proper opportunity to document and collect evidence. This is documented in subsequent court proceedings and in news reporting from 2008. The significance of this cannot be overstated. In any murder investigation, the physical evidence at the crime scene is the foundation of everything that follows. When that foundation is contaminated, when you cannot be certain what was there to begin with and what was introduced or removed after the fact, every subsequent inference drawn from that evidence becomes suspect. Defense lawyers in this case made this argument repeatedly and effectively, and the High Court's eventual acquittal reflected the weight of that argument. The second major evidentiary issue was the delayed discovery of Hemraj Banjade's body. When his body was found on the terrace more than 24 hours after the initial discovery of Aarushi's body, the scene up there had been exposed to conditions that made forensic analysis significantly more difficult. The evidence that might have existed on that terrace on the morning of May 16 was not the same evidence that was available when investigators eventually got up there on May 17. Again, this is not a technical procedural point. This is a fundamental investigative failure that directly affected the ability to understand what had happened. The third major evidentiary issue was the forensic analysis itself. Multiple forensic reports were produced over the course of this investigation. Some of those reports were contested. Interpretations differed. The prosecution and the defense drew completely different conclusions from the same physical evidence. In a case where there are no eyewitnesses and no confession, forensic evidence is everything. When that forensic evidence is itself disputed and when the chain of custody has been compromised from the beginning, the case becomes extraordinarily difficult to resolve. Could you look at either direction, either at the parents or at any other possible suspect, and say with certainty, this is who did it? If you can answer yes to that question, I would genuinely be interested to hear your reasoning in the comments. Because the Allahabad High Court, having reviewed all of the evidence and all of the trial proceedings, answered no. And I think understanding why they answered no is the key to understanding this entire case. Educated, professionally accomplished, residents of a modern apartment building in a city built on aspiration. The case touched nerves that went deep into Indian social consciousness. There were discussions in the media about class, about the relationship between employers and domestic workers, about assumptions that were made based on the social positions of the people involved. The way different individuals in this story were perceived publicly, which individuals received sympathy, which received suspicion, which were presumed innocent and which were presumed guilty, was inflected by these social dynamics in ways that were apparent to careful observers. Hemraj Banjade, for instance, was a Nepali man from a far more modest background than his employers. His status as a victim, as someone who was also murdered on that same night, received significantly less public and media attention in some quarters than the death of Aarushi. This disparity was noted and criticized by a number of journalists and commentators. Both victims deserved the same standard of investigation, the same public attention, the same relentless pursuit of justice. That this equal attention was not always forthcoming is itself part of the failure this case represents. The Indian media's coverage of the case was extensive and, at times, problematic. Theories were floated publicly. The reputations of living people, including people who were never formally charged with anything, were aired in newspapers and on television. Speculation was sometimes presented as fact. The intensity of the media coverage created an environment in which it became difficult to separate what was known from what was inferred, and what was inferred from what was imagined. The alternative theories, the ones that pointed away from the parents, were not abandoned because they were definitively disproven. They were set aside because the second CBI team found them unpersuasive. But the High Court, in its 2017 judgment, noted that these alternative possibilities had not been fully eliminated. The existence of those unexplored or incompletely investigated alternatives was itself a factor in the court's finding that the prosecution had not proven guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This matters enormously. In a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence, the prosecution must not only prove that the accused could have committed the crime. They must also prove, to the required legal standard, that nobody else could have. When alternative explanations exist and have not been fully investigated and ruled out, that requirement is very difficult to meet. Rajesh and Nupur Talwar had spent time in prison following their 2013 conviction. They had appealed, they had waited, and when the High Court set them free, the release was not a triumph in any ordinary sense. It was the conclusion of a years-long nightmare that had destroyed their lives in ways that could never be fully repaired. Their daughter was dead, the man who had worked in their home was dead. They had been publicly accused of murdering both. They had been tried, convicted, and imprisoned. And even after the High Court acquitted them and said that the prosecution had failed to prove its case, the questions did not go away. They could not go away, because the murders themselves were still unexplained. In 2020, Netflix released a documentary titled Behind Closed Doors, which examined the case and gave voice to various perspectives on what had happened. The documentary renewed public interest in the case and introduced it to a new generation of viewers, both in India and internationally, who might not have followed the original proceedings. It also underscored how unresolved everything remained, how the central questions of who killed Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade were still, more than a decade after their deaths, without a definitive answer. That much is not in dispute. We know that the initial investigation by the Noida police was seriously deficient. The crime scene was not secured. Evidence was compromised. The terrace was not searched promptly. These failures are documented in subsequent court proceedings and in extensive news reporting. We know that the case was transferred to the CBI on May 31, 2008. We know that the CBI conducted two separate investigations under two separate teams, and that those teams reached different conclusions. We know that the second team filed a closure report in December 2010 that named the parents as suspects while simultaneously acknowledging insufficient evidence to prosecute. We know that the special CBI court rejected that closure report and ordered a trial. We know that in November 2013, Rajesh and Nupur Talwar were convicted of murder and destruction of evidence and sentenced to life imprisonment. We know that they appealed. We know that the Allahabad High Court acquitted them on October 12, 2017, finding that the prosecution had failed to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. We know that the CBI filed an appeal in the Supreme Court. We know that as of the time this script was prepared, no perpetrator stands convicted for the deaths of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade. The case is legally unsolved. Those are the facts. Everything else, every theory about what happened that night, every interpretation of the evidence, every conclusion drawn from the circumstantial material, is in the realm of inference and speculation. And given how thoroughly the evidence base was compromised from the very beginning, those inferences and that speculation are unlikely to ever be resolved into certainty. When a case becomes this public, this intensely covered, this deeply embedded in the cultural conversation of an entire country, something happens to the people at the center of it. The victims become symbols before they can be fully mourned as human beings. The suspects become targets of public anger before due process has run its course. The investigators become characters in a narrative that is being written in real time, often in ways that are unfair to them and unhelpful to the investigation. Aarushi Talwar was a 13-year-old girl. Hemraj Banjade was a man who had traveled from Nepal to find work and support himself. Both of them were killed. Both of them deserved an investigation that was thorough, professional, and untainted by external pressure. They did not get that. And that failure, more than any theory about who committed these crimes, is the definitive legacy of this case. The trial court's rejection of that closure report and its decision to order a trial over the CBI's own objections represents a judicial system straining against itself. The eventual acquittal by the High Court represents the appellate mechanism doing its job, but only after two people had already been convicted and imprisoned. Each of these failures was an opportunity for the truth to emerge. Each of them, instead, became another layer of confusion and controversy piled on top of the original mystery. But for all of that reference and discussion and analysis, for all of the books and documentaries and articles and academic papers, the fundamental question remains unanswered. What happened in Flat L32 on the night of May 15, 2008? I ask because I genuinely believe that cases like this one force us to confront the limits of our systems. Courts can only work with the evidence brought before them. Investigators can only build cases on the evidence they collect. And when that evidence is compromised from the very beginning, the entire chain of justice is affected. The people who suffer most from that chain of failure are the victims themselves, who in this case included a 13-year-old girl and a working man from Nepal, both of whom deserved far better than they received. May 17, 2008. Hemraj Banjade's body is discovered on the terrace of the building, more than 24 hours after the initial discovery. May 31, 2008. The case is transferred from the Noida Police to the Central Bureau of Investigation. Over the following months and years, the first CBI team investigates and focuses on alternative suspects. That team is replaced by a second team. December 2010, the second CBI team files a closure report naming the parents as suspects while declining to prosecute due to insufficient evidence. The special CBI court rejects the closure report and orders a trial of Rajesh and Nupur Talwar. November 2013, the CBI Special Court in Ghaziabad finds Rajesh and Nupur Talwar guilty of murder and destruction of evidence and sentences them to life imprisonment. 2015, journalist Aviruk Sen publishes the book Aarushi, raising significant questions about the trial and the evidence. October 12, 2017, the Allahabad High Court acquits both Rajesh and Nupur Talwar, finding that the prosecution failed to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The CBI files an appeal in the Supreme Court of India. 2020. Netflix releases the documentary Behind Closed Doors, bringing the case to international attention. Present. No perpetrator stands convicted for the deaths of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade. The case remains legally unsolved. It was investigated by multiple teams. It went to trial. Verdicts were returned. Appeals were heard. At every stage, someone made a decision about what the evidence meant. And at the end of all of it, the answer was the same: we don't know. And for India as a whole, the case stands as a reminder of how much depends on those critical first hours of an investigation. The decisions made in those hours, the protocols followed or not followed, the care taken or not taken to preserve and document the evidence, can determine whether justice is possible at all. When those first hours are squandered, as they were in this case, the consequences echo for years and decades. The forensic samples whose chain of custody was compromised. The crime scene that was photographed by press cameras before it was properly documented by investigators. In criminal investigations, time is not just valuable. It is irreplaceable. Evidence degrades. Memories fade. Witnesses move on. Scenes change. Every hour that passes after a crime is committed is an hour of potential truth that slips away. In this case, those hours were not used well. And the result is that we are left, more than 15 years later, asking the same questions that were asked on the morning of May 16, 2008. What happened that night? Who was responsible? And will we ever know? The honest answer to that last question is that it seems increasingly unlikely. The legal proceedings have run their course at the trial and appellate levels, with the current situation being that no one stands convicted. The Supreme Court appeal is ongoing as of available public records, but even if that appeal were to produce a final definitive judgment, it would be working with the same contaminated, compromised evidence base that has frustrated every previous proceeding. The case became embedded in larger social debates in ways that sometimes made it difficult to see it simply as what it fundamentally was: a criminal case in which two people were killed and justice has not been achieved. That is not to say that those broader debates are unimportant. The class dynamics of the case are real and worth examining. The media's role is worth examining. The institutional failures are worth examining. All of those things matter. But they matter most when they are examined in service of understanding what happened to two specific human beings on a specific night in May 2008. Not as symbols or as stand-ins for larger social arguments, but as Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade, two people whose lives were taken and who deserved, and still deserve, the truth. It has been examined by investigative journalists, by legal scholars, by filmmakers, by documentary makers, by the courts of multiple jurisdictions. It has generated more public discussion and analysis than almost any other criminal case of the past 2 decades in India. And at the end of all of that examination and analysis and discussion, the core question remains open. This is what makes it, in the truest sense of the phrase, an unsolved mystery. And if you found this case as compelling and as troubling as I do, please like this video, subscribe to True Crime Mysteries, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future cases. We cover the stories that matter, the cases where justice was elusive, where systems failed, where the truth proved harder to find than anyone expected. And we do it because we believe that keeping these stories alive, keeping the questions open, keeping the conversation going, is itself a form of respect for the people at the center of them. The case of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade deserves to be remembered. Not as a scandal, not as a controversy, but as a reminder of how much we owe to the victims of crime, namely the truth, and how serious the consequences are when we fail to deliver it. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.